Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Andrews, and I'm the president-elect of the Management Society. We are excited to welcome Management Society members and alumni from all over the world. For those who are unfamiliar with the Management Society, we are an organization dedicated to growing moral and ethical leadership in business and community. We are so excited to hear from Dr. Pope as we further explore the importance of ethical decision making. And Brad Agel is going to give a little bit more detailed introduction this morning. Brad?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brad Agel. I am on the board of the BYU Management Society and head up the curriculum for the society. And it is truly my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce my friend, Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope, to you this morning. I'm first going to just read a short formal biography of Dr. Pope, and then I will give a short personal introduction. So first, Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope is an associate professor in the School of Accountancy and Management Information Systems at DePaul University, where she teaches managerial and forensic accounting. Her research focuses on organizational misconduct, ethics and fraud, and organizational culture and compliance systems designed to confront these challenges. Kelly's research on organizational misconduct culminated into directing and producing the award-winning documentary, All the Queen's Horses, in 2017, which streamed on Netflix from July 2018 through 2019. All the Queen's Horses explores the largest municipal fraud in US history and premiered as the #1 documentary on iTunes, Amazon Prime Video, Google Play, and DirecTV during its debut week on the video on-demand platforms in April of 2018. In 2018, Kelly became a TED speaker with her impactful and timely TED Talk entitled How Whistleblowers Shape History. She recently launched her second strategic venture or startup venture, an educational technology company called Red Flag Mania, which is an immersive investigative experience that teaches students and corporate learners how to spot red flags in complex transactions. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Pope about 3 years ago at a conference in Chicago, where she was actually screening the documentary, All the Queen's Horses. Not only was I incredibly impressed by this documentary, but I was blown away by the director and producer of this documentary. And as I told Kelly earlier this week, probably the one talent I have is somehow I have the ability to recognize really quality people and somehow convince them to work with me. And Kelly was and is certainly one of those people. I had the privilege of hosting her at BYU as a visitor about 1.5 years ago. And it was one of the most delightful days of my life, day and a half. So the thing about Kelly is she is so incredibly curious about the world and inquisitive. I've brought dozens of people to the BYU campus, and I'm quite confident that I have never had anyone ask me more questions than Kelly did. And we've continued that relationship since then, and she continues to ask me all kinds of questions, and we have a marvelous conversation going on. Kelly has become a great fan. We've become a great fan of Kelly, and she's become a great friend to BYU. We anticipate having her back on campus this coming fall. And with that, I don't want to take any more of her time. Please join in welcoming and giving a warm BYU welcome to Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope.
Thank you so much, Brad, for that wonderful introduction. I will tell you, I go to a lot of university visits, and I can honestly say my favorite visit was coming to BYU. It was such a wonderful experience for me, and I look forward to coming back again soon. So I am excited to share some thinking with you all today. It's just a small group of us today, right? Just not that many of us. But I'm excited to talk with you about today's topic. I want to start by saying thank you so much for this introduction and this opportunity. And I am going to share my screen. And before I start talking, I just need a thumbs up from someone that you can see my screen when I start sharing it. Okay, so I am going to share right now. And you should see my screen. Does everybody see my screen? Okay, I think, yes, good, perfect. I'll tell you guys, I've done a presentation for an hour and my screen wasn't showing, and it was fine because we were doing great stories. So thanks for the thumbs up that you can see it. So today's topic is about the importance of ethical decision-making in today's economy. And as you heard in my introduction, I am an accountant, but I feel like I'm a very non-traditional accountant, and you'll see why as I start talking. So just a little bit of background about me that Brad didn't say is I consider myself or classify myself as a left-handed CPA who uses filmmaking to teach life lessons about decision-making. And I am a very curious person. Some people might say nosy, but I've figured out how to turn it into a very fruitful career in terms of teaching individuals how to find their voices and exercising their voices once they find them. And I do a lot of that, a lot of my teaching and training through the use of film. And I've always loved TV. I've always loved story. And I just figured out a way to incorporate that into my teaching so that I can pull things out of my students and my learners that help them grow as individuals. So I hope you have that experience today too, as we go through and you learn a little bit about me and my methods. So this is me. That's me there with the dress and the socks and the shoes. And that was my first teacher. And as I say on this slide, it all started in the classroom. My father was a professor, and he was my first teacher. And from that age, I think I'm age 3 or 4, I knew then that I wanted to follow in the footsteps of my dad. My father passed away in 1999 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but he was my icon my entire life and still continues to be my icon. And I would go to the classroom with him all the time. He was a college professor. He was the dean of a business school at North Carolina Central University and later became the chancellor of North Carolina Central University. And so I've grown up on a college campus in a classroom my entire life. And I feel like that's where I shine. One, because I can help people. I can help teach people and I can help people grow. And I saw that in his life and I wanted to follow in the same footsteps. But his life was really a blueprint for me. And I learned a lot from him. Now, I'll tell you how my childhood impacted the research and the work I do now. So I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and my neighbor behind me was this really wonderful family by the name of the Dorches. And Mr. Dorch was a banker, very top executive at one of the banks. It was Nations Bank at the time, which is now Bank of America. And then one day, Mr. Dorch just disappeared. And what happened is what you see on the slide here is this was in the Herald Sun. I think they changed the name of the paper now, but ex-banker faces prison term and fine. And so this story is about my neighbor, and he lived right behind me. They were friends with my parents. And Mr. Dorch had a wife, had a son, but yet Mr. Dorch found himself in a very compromising situation. He made an unethical decision. And so as you see in the first paragraph, his name, Mr. Dorch to me, I can never call him his first name, could face a prison sentence of more than 200 years on his conviction of defrauding the bank of more than $2 million. And this is in the 80s, so that's still a large number. He could also be fined $1.7 million when he's sentenced in July on fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy convictions. According to prosecutors, Mr. Dorch schemed with Durham developer Gary Lynn Wallace to remove from Nations Bank's books a series of improper loans that Mr. Dorch had made to Mr. Wallace in the late 1980s. Now, this happened when I was junior and senior in high school. And what I noticed about my dad is he supported his friend. He went to court. He was there as a support system for him. And even though he did something wrong, he still supported him and was there and tried to help his family. And I witnessed that. And so there were a couple of things that I learned as I watched how my dad interacted with the person that made a mistake. And that was that people make mistakes. People deserve second chances. And there still can be some good in a person, even when they make a mistake. And so that lesson that I learned when I was in high school, and I watched how my dad moved around in terms of his leadership strategy, it really impacted me. So when I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD in accounting, ethical decision making was one of my interests. But I've decided I wanted to look at it from a different lens. And the lens I started to look at it from was the lens of fraud. And when I say when fraud means to me when ethics is absent, when people make missteps, often they find themselves in a fraudulent situation, just like Mr. Dortch. So I started to look at ethical decision-making from the lens of fraud. And so here's just another picture of my dad and myself. When he, as I told you, he became the chancellor of North Carolina Central University. And you see me there, I think I'm holding, can't remember if it's a Bible or what, it's something very sacred in this ceremony. And my dad is to the right, and he's taken the pledge to do good for the university. And I was there and I witnessed that. And so this was at that picture, I think I am going to 7th grade. And we had to move into a new house. And so I watched again my dad's leadership journey and how he governed and managed the university. Well, something happened in his tenure. And around year 5 of his 6-year tenure, he had a faculty member that did something unethical. And so what happened is there was a faculty member that mismanaged a grant. And so everybody was in uproar. And of course, my dad was in uproar too. But what he did was he had to follow the rules. There was a protocol set in place by the university. And one of the things that everybody wanted to do is they wanted to immediately fire this faculty member. And my dad said, "Oh no, that's not the rules. This is the process that we've set out in place." And because my dad honored the process, he was under attack. And so in 1991, you see on the right-hand side, Chancellor at NCCU to leave post. My dad decided to go back into the classroom because he felt like doing the right thing and supporting the process and letting the process play out and not attacking this individual was what no one else wanted to do. So it taught me a lot of things, and it had a big impact on me. And it's interesting because one of the things I'm doing right now in my life is I'm working on a book. And as I'm working on this book, I'm looking into the past, my past, on what's motivated me and how I've shaped my ethical voice. And it brought me back to doing some research on my dad's career, my dad's life. So I've been digging in the archives and learning more about this fraud case that he was around and how it impacted him. And so as I've been doing this reflection, there were a couple of lessons that I learned that is still shaping even my ethical voice and development. And that is the importance of always leading with integrity. And as I read about my dad's position, he wanted to honor the process and nobody else did. And so my second point of what I learned in this is doing what's right is not always what's popular. And my dad had to make a decision. Do I do the right thing or do I do what everybody else wants me to do? And his choice was to do the right thing. And that's why he decided to step down. And then this last point, and it's really meant to be a point of humor. If we were all together, hopefully we would be chuckling together. Adults actually make a ton of mistakes. It's something that I also learned. As I watched this as a child, as I still interact with the kinds of individuals I work with in studying fraud and ethical decision-making. So just a little bit about me, background. I went on and again, followed in my dad's footsteps. I had got my Bachelor's of Science in Accounting at North Carolina A&T State University. And then I went on and got my master's and PhD at Virginia Tech. And it's at Virginia Tech where I started really researching how fraud impacts decision-making. And so I didn't want to only study it from the perspective of theory. I really wanted to study it from the perspective of understanding the mindset of people that have these ethical lapses. So I started going around and interviewing and talking to white collar felons. Now, one of the things I think is really important when we start talking about the importance of ethical decision making is understanding why people make poor decisions sometimes. So I want to pause here and I want you to watch this short video. And what this video is going to show you or help illustrate is how fraud can happen. Okay, so I'm going to play this and hopefully everybody can hear it okay.
I'll give you a story about one particular individual. We'll call him Harry. Harry was a 45-year-old accounting manager, and he worked for a Rust Belt company in the Midwest, and he finds his job is moved overseas. The company can't be competitive in this country anymore. He's out of work. Now, he didn't realize it would take him 2 years and completely exhaust his savings, but he found a new job. Didn't pay as much as his old job, but it was a new job. He had a great attitude, and he was looking at this as a new opportunity. 6 months into his job, he gets a frantic call from his wife. It seems their little girl riding her bicycle didn't see the crack in the sidewalk. Wheel gets caught in the crack, flips it over. She flies over the handlebars, lands on the concrete on her face, horribly disfiguring herself. So Harry rushes to the hospital, runs up to the doctor, and says, "Is my little girl going to be okay?" The doctor assures Harry she's going to be fine. Harry, she took a really tough fall and she's in bad shape. She looks bad, but with some operations, some plastic surgery, the right doctor, she'll be good. I'm sure your insurance will take care of that. Don't worry about it. Well, turns out that, gee, if his girl was 7 years old, the HMO would have covered it, but because she was 8, and that's a shame, they called that cosmetology and elective surgery, and they wouldn't pay for it. He needs about $50,000 for surgeries for his little girl. He is in charge of accounts payable, and while he doesn't have authorized access to cash, he has access to cash. Now, how do I rationalize stealing money from my company? This is a hard one. It's his little girl. In about 15 minutes of thinking about that, Harry set up some bogus accounts, ran through the checks, cashed the checks, had his $50,000, and his little girl had her operations. That was it. He was just going to do it one time. Goes back to work, a happy man. Nobody caught him. A few months later, he gets another call from his wife. Her father just died. Her mother has Alzheimer's, so she's coming to live with them. And, oh, yes, and she's unexpectedly pregnant with their third child. All he has to do is rationalize stealing the money from the company. And it took a little bit longer, but here was his rationalization process. It's not my fault. My job went overseas. It's not my fault I got this lousy health insurance company. It's not my fault that my father-in-law died. It's not my fault that my wife's pregnant. Well, maybe that was his fault. So again, it's very easy for him to rationalize that, and he did it again, second time. And all this goes on undetected. This went on for 3 years, and by the time we caught up with Harry, he had stolen $3 million from the company. So where does Harry end up? Harry ends up convicted. He served 3 years in prison. His wife left him. He lost everything. His job, his wife, his family, his self-respect. He lost everything. That is your typical white-collar criminal. No intention to do harm. Truly sorry for what they have done. But somehow, some way, rationalize what they did.
So we're all back together, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. That was an interview that I did with a former forensic accountant partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that's a true story. And as we were doing this interview, he was reflecting on a case that he worked on where this gentleman was facing pressure and made a bad decision. And as I use this story a lot in the training and the teaching that I do, what I find with audiences is how relatable Harry's story is. His daughter was hurt. His health insurance didn't cover the necessary surgery. So he felt that my back is against the wall. What am I going to do? So he made an unethical decision, and it really impacted his entire life. And so I like using this because it really shows us how fraud can begin, how unethical decision-making can begin, how life pressures can often enter into our environment and we can make these unethical choices. And so I hope by the way I teach and the way I interact with my students, that they are able to make these decisions in a safe classroom environment before they actually are faced with making a decision like Harry. So something that I want to share with you that I did that actually changed my life, just changed the way I teach, changed the way that I think about ethics and fraud, is about 7 years ago, I decided that I was going to be a director and a producer of a documentary film. And, sometimes you have these crazy ideas, and I can say that these are these famous last words. I said, I could probably do this. Little did I know that it would take me 5.5 years to complete such a project. But I decided that I was going to direct and produce a documentary called All the Queen's Horses. And Brad mentioned it in the introduction. And as you see in the middle, how could one woman steal $53 million without anyone noticing? Now, clearly, this person made a very unethical decision. Before I start telling you about the film and about the lessons learned and about how it shaped me, I want to share with you the quick trailers. Just a minute.
She completely pulled the wool over her town's eyes.
Do you think you were just smarter than everybody else, Rita?
$53+ million is just unbelievable.
She lived quite a life, totally different life than what she portrayed here.
By day, she's wearing municipal clothes, and by night, she's dripping with jewels and furs.
World champion Rita Cronwell.
She had this grand, high-stakes horse empire.
My first thought was, Dixon has that much money? That you could embezzle that much money from a little tiny place like this?
People just trusted her so well, more than anything.
Rita, how did you go to bed and not think, whose lives I'm infecting here?
One of the things the FBI wanted to find out was, did she do this alone? Was she hiding for somebody else?
For 20 years, I worked side by side with this woman, and I never knew her. I never really knew her.
So today is Friday. So if you're looking for an outstanding, and I'm completely biased, if you're looking for an outstanding documentary to watch, if you have Amazon Prime, it's on Amazon. If you want to watch it on YouTube for free, it just has commercials on YouTube. It's there too for All the Queen's Horses. And I'll tell you a couple of things that I learned from this story. And as you saw, the person that you see pictured on this image is Rita Cronwell. And Rita Cronwell embezzled $53 million over 20 years. And clearly she made a very unethical decision. And what I started to do is when this story hit the Chicago Tribune in April of 2012, when I read the headlines, I was shocked. And so I was surprised at what was the environment like that allowed a person to think that they could steal this amount of money and no one would miss it or no one would catch them. And so I started to I began to become very intrigued, and I thought, hey, I'll make a film about this. So I went back and forth to Dixon numerous times to collect interviews over this 5.5-year period. And there were a couple of lessons learned. Now I have a couple there on the slide, but I also want to share with you a couple of just personal and growth lessons that I experienced. So Dixon, Illinois is a town that's in sort of Western Illinois. A population of 16,000 people, not very diverse at all. Actually, I think when I would go to Dixon, I think I added to the diversity statistic because everybody knew when I was in town because there's not a lot of people in Dixon that look like me. And I went there asking questions. And I feel like because it was me, I was able to introduce a community to a different person. And so they embraced me. And they were really eager to understand what Rita did, because what the media focused on was this person stole this money and lived this lavish lifestyle. What no one was really talking about is how did this happen? Now, we don't necessarily know the why. I can speculate why I think she did it because no one was looking. But the documentary talks about how she did it. And just for you, if you're on the edge of your seats and you want to know how she did it, this is what she did. She just moved money from one account to the next. She created fictitious invoices and no one was looking, and she was able to move about 40 of the $53 million that way. So Rita currently is sitting in an Illinois federal prison. She received 19 years and 7 months in federal prison. But a couple of lessons that I learned from this story, and that is one, to pay close attention to red flags. There were tons of red flags all around this situation that no one paid attention to. Maybe because they trusted her. And as you see on the second bullet, trust is never an internal control. And if there's one thing that you take away from today, remember, trust is never internal control. And it's something that we do naturally, but we have to use the internal controls that we put in place in order to protect ourselves and protect our organizations. Another lesson that I learned from this is everyone needs to know accounting. And although, again, another little piece of humor, and I'm an accounting professor, but I'm going to say everyone needs to know accounting. And I'm going to tell you why. One of the reasons why Rita was able to do this is because all the power, all the knowledge lied in one person. So no one felt that they needed to know anything because Rita knew it. And she became the most powerful person in the town. And if you look at a lot of the fraud research shows you that a lot of fraud happens and starts with the accounting and finance group, primarily because a lot of the control of the decisions happen there. So this is one of my beliefs. Everyone needs to know accounting. Why? So you can ask good questions. And there are people that just asked a couple of questions, they would have known. Now, Rita Cronwell, just by profile, I'll tell you, she was one of the #1 quarter horse breeders in the country. And she owned over 400 quarter horses. She worked for the city of Dixon for about 21 years. And she, in 2012, made a salary of $80,000. Now, a salary of $80,000 and a person owning 400 horses seems to be a mismatch, right? Now, something else that she did that was a huge red flag that people didn't pay attention to is that she took 4 months off a year. And people probably thought, oh, we're just so lucky to have Rita. We're happy that she's here and we're not going to question it. But 4 months out of the year off on vacation is a pretty significant amount of time. So this story, when I say that it has changed my life, it shaped me in so many ways. One, because of all the communities that it touched. And it's one of the reasons why I started using film as a way to shape the way we think about and talk about ethical decision making. Because through Rita's story, we can have natural conversations, not forced conversations. And so I also learned the impact of having a scalable ethics message. Now, what's interesting about All the Queen's Horses is a lot of people see a lot of different storylines in it. Accounting people see an accounting story. The equestrian community sees a horse story. The regulators see a regulatory story. Auditors see an audited story. But it's the power of story. Ethicists see an ethics story. And so this really shaped the way that I started talking about ethics and talking about fraud, because people can start to dissect their decisions through the path of Rita. And I think that that's really important when we're talking about very touchy subjects like fraud and decision-making. Now, I want to say that one of the things that I have done in my life is I started, as I said, using film, but I started using story as a way to understand how people make decisions. And so what I do when I'm not in class is I go around the country and I do on-camera interviews with white-collar felons, victims of fraud, and whistleblowers. And I try to learn and understand what happened to their thought process. So this is just a collage of a few people that I have talked to over the past couple of years. And so the first, with my left, the person that has the flags behind him, that is Nathan Mueller. The gentleman right below Nathan Mueller, the African-American male in the suit, that's Preston Byrd. The image that's the one that's in the middle, that is Rob Lattis. Diane Katani is to the left. Garrett Bauer is far right corner. Going down is Apollo Nida, and then below that is Helen Starkey. And then in the far corner is Jason Ches. Now, we're going to try a little game here. We're going to try a little game. What I want to do is I want, with the next 5 or 6 descriptions I can tell, whose story do you want to hear about? And so you have to give me a description. I wasn't smart enough to put a number on each picture, but I want you to put either, let's say, in the chat or question and answer. Which one is better? The chat, maybe? Let's see. I'm in the chat. So I'm in the chat. And so I'm just going to read. Someone says flags. I'm going to put my timer on. I'm going to see who would get the most votes. I'm going to look at 30 seconds. And I'm just going to see. So Brad, if you're there, I want you to help me tally up which one we're going to do. We might do 2 because we have a little bit of time. So you got to help me look. Oh, wow. It looks like a tie right now. Oh, goodness. You guys want to hear about everybody. Oh, my goodness. Okay.
You're the accountant, Kelly. I can't count that fast.
Okay, we're going to hit time in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. Okay. Let's see. Who are we going to pick?
I think I saw a lot from the lady in the bottom.
And you know what I love about what they said about the lady in the bottom is Star Trek, because you're saying Star Trek, you're saying that her outfit reminds you of that, right? That's what I think they're saying, which is sort of funny to me. Because it does. I never thought about that. So we'll start with Helen. That's Helen Starkey. Helen Starkey, I love what someone said in the chat. The woman has an honest face. She absolutely does. She does. But let's dissect that. What does that really mean? I don't know. It means something to us. So whoever said that, let's think about what does that mean? But she looks friendly. She looks approachable. She has no nonverbal cues. It looks as though she's guarded, right? She looks like she looks like a mom that might be a soccer mom. Her kids might play soccer with your kids, right? I love what I'm seeing in the chat. Don't judge a book by its cover. Perfect. It just looks like she is somebody that you could easily hire and trust everything she says. Well, Helen Starkey faced a pretty interesting situation. She was an accountant at Dynergy, the company in Houston. And this was right around the Enron time. And what happened is there was a very complex accounting transaction that her team was managing. And Helen was the lowest on the totem pole, okay? And what happened is there were some questionable transactions that her accounting team was suggesting. Their auditors agreed with it. Now, this is during the Enron days. So there was a lot of creative accounting that was acceptable during those days that may not be so acceptable now. And so Helen was part of this team where they were advancing some very aggressive practices. And here's the interesting thing. Her boss wouldn't sign off on anything. He asked Helen to do it. So Helen felt very helpless. She felt as though she couldn't push back because she was the most junior person on the team. So Helen followed orders and signed off. Okay, she signed off on these documents. Well, months later, the regulators came in, SEC came in, Dynergy was under investigation for these questionable practices, and executives started going to jail. They were indicted and went to jail. Well, Helen was looped up into this whole scenario. Why? Because her name was on the documents. Her boss wasn't indicted though. Her name was on the documents. So Helen spent years trying to fight, had hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal bills saying, hey, listen, I was the most junior person on this team. I was just following orders. I really didn't know what was going on. But what she heard was, well, why is your name on these documents? If you didn't know what was going on, why would you sign off on this? And my boss told me to do it wasn't the answer. So to make a long story short, Helen was indicted. She was convicted, sentenced, and she spent 30 days in a federal prison. Now, because Helen wanted to be in prison close to her house, she spent 30 days in a maximum security prison. So what we see on television or what movies are made off of, that's where she was. That honest face is where she was for 30 days. And so, although it might not sound like a lot, it may not sound like a super long prison term, it's impacted her entire life. She is just now, say last year, just getting her life back on track. She learned that she couldn't do basic things like volunteer for her schools, with her school, at her kid's school, because she was a convicted felon. She couldn't even be a barber or a hairstylist because she was a convicted felon. I see in the chat, there's a question, did she personally make any money during this time? No, she did not. Her name was just on the document. She didn't receive a big bonus, none of that. So that's Helen's story. Helen is a speaker in my class. And Brad, I know that you have an amazing ethics class. If you were ever looking for an outstanding speaker, Helen's a good one because her journey is very relatable to that student that's in school, because a lot of our kids are going to go into corporations and be faced with these types of decisions. And so what is your moral compass? What is your voice? How do you stay in a certain area so that you don't make these decisions? Or who is your mentors around you that can protect you from this? So that's Helen's story. I'm gonna look, I have time, I'm gonna do another one. Let's see, who else did we?
So Kelly, I kind of looked and it looks like the three that people were talking about is the gentleman on the right of our screen, the woman at the top, and the biggest picture, the guy in the biggest picture.
Oh, okay, all right. So, oh, there's so many. Okay, I can't choose. There's so many. Okay, we're gonna have to do this again so I can get through all these people. I shouldn't have put so many pictures on the picture on the screen. Okay, I'm gonna pick one for you guys. I'm gonna pick. I'll do a hodgepodge. So the person at the top is Nathan Mueller. Nathan Mueller embezzled $8.5 million from ING. He was a CPA, not a CPA anymore, and went to prison for 6.5 years. And that's his story. The gentleman at the bottom, I saw a couple people ask about him. That's Preston Bird. Preston Bird is interesting. And his story is he embezzled funds in a real estate transaction. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting about Preston in comparison to everybody else. Preston is the only person that I've ever interviewed that has not admitted guilt. He said he did not do it. There's nothing wrong with it, even though all the evidence is pointing in the direction that he did. He is certain that he did not do it. So when he came to do a presentation with my students, half my class thought he was lying and half of the class thought he wasn't. So to see the interaction between the two camps is pretty interesting. And so the person I'm talking about is bottom left, Preston Bird, African-American, red tie. That's what I'm talking about. But now I'm going to move into the middle. The middle is Bob Lattis. That's the largest picture. And I put him as the largest picture for a reason. Because Bob has had the biggest impact on my life currently. And Bob was a colleague of mine at DePaul. He taught Intro to Financial Accounting. He was one of our instructors. He was a full-time instructor. He went to DePaul undergrad and went to Indiana University for his law degree. He was an intern in the White House. I think, who would this have been? Clinton administration. He was an intern then. And so very successful real estate attorney in the Chicagoland area, super successful. And what Bob found himself involved in was a very complicated real estate transaction. And I say complicated, but let me say it was simple. There was a buyer and a seller, right? And Bob was the attorney on the seller side. So he represented the seller. And so what happened is apparently the buyer and seller were in cahoots and had recruited straw buyers to buy these properties, these real estate properties in very depressed areas of Chicago. In the south side of Chicago, there is a lot of dilapidated buildings, and it's a very tough neighborhood. And so Bob and his investors went into this neighborhood to buy up these properties, to rehab these properties. Well, what was happening is the real estate team was propping up properties, and then all these properties fell into foreclosure. So the banks lost money, the communities were, fell apart even more. And Bob and his team, at one point, they were making a significant amount of money doing this. So 10 years later, after these transactions had happened, there's an indictment that was, well, it was sealed, now it's unsealed, about Bob and his engagement or his relationship in these transactions. Well, because Bob was an attorney and because he was a CPA, and his role was to protect the public trust in both of those professions, the government was very harsh in terms of how they handled Bob's case. And so Bob claims that he did not know what his client was involved in and what his client was doing. But all the evidence showed that Bob knew. And so I would go to trial, sort of exactly what my dad did. Bob was a friend, just like Mr. Dortch was my dad's friend. I was trying to be there to be supportive of Bob. And I was going to court. I was there for sentencing. I met his family. I even had my students write letters to talk about how his story impacted their lives. So I was trying to help him, trying to help him find his voice, because I believed that he was telling the truth. Well, when I went to sentencing, I found out that that wasn't necessarily the case, because the evidence showed that he knew all along. The evidence showed that he intentionally targeted these low-income neighborhoods to try to pump up the value of the real estate and then pull the money out. And I was devastated, because this is my friend. And so even to this day, when I write to him and he writes to me, or he'll email me and I'll email him back, I'm still conflicted, because I don't know if he's being completely honest yet. So that's why his picture is the largest picture on this screen, because I'm still trying to understand, should I believe him? Should I not? What did he do? What didn't he do? Do I follow the evidence? Do I not? I know what my training is in forensic accounting, but what do I do? Because this is my friend. So that's why Bob's picture is the largest. Now, just because we have a few minutes of time left right now, I'll open it up to questions. The other pictures, the picture on my far left, Caucasian male, black jacket, brown tie. That's Garrett Bauer. Garrett Bauer was involved in the largest insider trading scheme in U.S. history, because you don't see a lot of those anymore. And so I had the opportunity of interviewing Garrett right before he went to federal prison. It's funny, short story. He actually lived in a beautiful condo on the upper west side of New York. I mean, I had never been in a condo this huge. And so, it was so nice, so welcoming. And he was very honest. Yeah, I got inside information. I, traded on it, and now I'm in trouble for it. But I'll tell you what was interesting when Garrett spoke to my students. The first question one of my students asked was, well, how do I do what you did and not get caught? And I looked, and I had to put my mama face on, because I looked and I said, I know you didn't just say that. And we had to have a long talk afterwards, because I didn't want them to miss the learning opportunity in hearing from Garrett's story and understanding what he did wrong. So middle picture, the small picture in the middle, the other African-American gentleman in the corner on the page, that's Apollo and Ida. Just crazy, funny story. Accountants end up doing very odd things, right? That is one of the former stars from The Real Housewives of Atlanta, that was involved in a identity theft and mortgage fraud case that I ended up doing an interview with, and ended up on one of the episodes because I was interviewing him for some fraud research. So long story, but fraud takes me in a lot of interesting places. So I have tons of these experiences, and they've all really shaped me to be far more reflective than I think that I may otherwise be. And I try to share my reflections and open up with my students or whoever I'm interacting with about these cases, because a lot of times you understand the decisions that they make and hope that you would never make those same decisions. So I want to pause here because we have time for questions. I'm going to go back and look at the chat and go up and try to get to as many questions as I possibly can. I've shared a lot, told you a lot, just gave you a little bit of the surface, but there's tons of things in my head. So ask whatever you like. There's my email and my phone. Call me, text me, email me. If you have a great fraud story that you want to talk to, because everybody tends to have one, let me know, because I always love a good story.
We have some questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
One of the first ones is, looking back on things, do you believe that your dad made the right choice in stepping down from his position? Or do you think that he could have done more good staying in place and working from that place?
That's a great question, whoever asked that. You know, I think my dad, looking back, and now that I'm really going into all those documents, I do think he made the right choice for him. One of the things that when he became chancellor, one of the things that he always did was he had a plan B. And so one of the things that he had noticed is a lot of times when people become chancellors or presidents of universities, they sell their house and sell their car. And so they're beholden to living in the university house, and that's their whole life. So they always have to chase that type of job. And so one of the things that he was very, very certain that he would never do was do that. So we still kept our family home. We drove our own cars, so that he always wanted to have an exit if he needed to on his terms. And so I think that he just felt that the voice of everyone else was just too strong, and he just didn't believe in it, because ultimately what he wanted to do was he wanted to be able to sleep at night. And I do think that there could have been good that he could have done had he stayed, but you have to have supporters around you. You have to have people around you so that you can execute whatever the mission is you're trying to do. And I just felt like there were more people that were interested in not following the rules and following the protocol. And it just felt probably just too strong, too much for him to bear. But thank you so much for that question. You made me think. I haven't been asked that before, but I will tell you guys this. That is the first time I've ever shared that story. I've never told anybody about that publicly. So it's just a small group of us here, right? Not that many of us. But now you just know that story. So this is my first time sharing it. So I've never really had to think of that aspect of the question. So that is my first answer off the top of my head, but that's coming from my heart.
Absolutely. Here's another great one. Is ethics ever subjective, especially from the perspective of a whistleblower?
Say the first part again. Is
ethics ever subjective, and especially from the perspective of a whistleblower?
So I'm assuming to restate that. I think it can be subjective. One of the things that when I'm interviewing whistleblowers, and oftentimes the whistleblowers that I've worked with have evidence and data to support the decisions that they believe in, because I think sometimes when you are dealing with subjectivity, it's much harder to prove. And so a lot of the whistleblowers that I've worked with have a nice audit trail and data that support whatever the position that they are trying to make. And it's still a hard conversation to have. But I do think that it can be, but just oftentimes my experiences hasn't been that.
Okay. And then are you seeing that occurrences of fraud are trending up or down? And do you see a difference between public companies? Is it getting better or worse at public companies versus private companies? Some of your input on that.
Yeah, I think that fraud is steady. I think what we're seeing is it's being publicized and reported more. Now that we have a 24-hour news cycle, now that everybody is a journalist, everybody's a blogger, you just have so much more information. So those stories are out more. But I think like the fraud schemes are the same with the exception of the COVID schemes that are out now. But the traditional schemes are still there. I do think there is a difference between the public whistleblowers frauds versus the private. And I can use the Dixon, Illinois fraud case as an example. I think that in that case, the fraud was discovered by a whistleblower, and I didn't mention that earlier. The whistleblower in the Dixon fraud case was a woman by the name of Kathy Swanson. And Kathy was a shero. People were so happy that she came forward and blew the whistle and told what she knew. And I think that because she was protecting taxpayer dollars, I think she was embraced in a different way. If Kathy had been in a corporation where that news would have depressed a stock price and investors would have lost money, I think she wouldn't have been embraced in the same way. So I do think that there's a difference in terms of the treatment.
And this is a great follow-up also. Do you feel like one type of business is most vulnerable to fraud? Is it the small, the medium, the large, the nonprofit, or is it pretty equal opportunity that way?
I think fraud is an equal opportunity business, unfortunately. I think like you look at Nathan Mueller, he was the gentleman on my page. It was the far left with the flags in the back. I mean, he was at ING, multi-million-dollar, maybe billion-dollar financial institution at the time, compared to Dixon, who had a $6 to $8 million annual budget, and Rita embezzles $53 million of that. So, you have we're on two sides of the coin here. And so I don't think that because you're small, you're more susceptible. Because you're large, you're more susceptible. I think trust is something that is inevitable in any size organization, which makes us all susceptible to it, which is why we have to pay attention to the red flags, because they're all around us all the time.
In your research on the Rita Cronwell case, were there any discoveries that really especially surprised you in those conversations?
Yes. Yes. Okay. So in Dixon, as I told you, western part of the state, there's a neighboring town called Sterling, Illinois. Same population size, around 16,000, $6 to $8 million budget annually, like Dixon. And so what happened was there were two different forms of government. Dixon was on a commissioner style government. Sterling, however, had a city manager format. And so their city manager was getting prepared for one of their city council meetings and was looking at all the information statewide on fund balances and fund, and not fund, I'm saying F-U-N-D, fund balances. And the gentleman noticed that Dixon and two other towns had a significantly negative fund balance. So like Dixon had like a negative 58% fund balance where everybody else was positive. And so he became concerned and he wrote a letter to the Dixon City Council. And so this letter is delivered to Dixon City Council. And I always thought that letter probably ended up on Rita's desk, and Rita read it and probably threw it away because she probably thought, oh my goodness, they're on to me. When I was doing my interviews and talking to different residences in the town, I happened to talk to someone that was on city government that actually got the letter. And I asked him, I said, the letter that, his name was Scott Schumar, the letter that Scott wrote, what did you think about it? He said, oh, we got that letter. We read the letter. We saw what he was warning us about, and we completely threw it. We disregarded it and threw it away. We thought that Dixon was jealous of us, and we didn't pay any attention to it. So they completely overlooked the red flag. This was 18 months before Rita was arrested. That I thought was shocking. The second thing I thought was shocking, when I would go to Dixon and talk to people, the people that were younger, so your millennials, your Gen Zs, those people were far more embracing Rita than the baby boomers. They thought, oh, she did something wrong. She'll never do it again. We still like her. We still love her. And so I thought that was shocking at how accepting they still were of her. I will tell you this piece of little information. Rita filed and asked to be released from prison back in 2020 due to COVID. And so she wrote to the judge and said, listen, I've served almost half of my sentence. So there were some provisions that could be met, that you could be released due to COVID. It was a compassionate release. And so she wrote and said, I'm almost to those qualifications. Will you let me out of prison? Judge said no. People were in an uproar when they found out that she had asked to be released. So there is a huge population of people that are still very angry. I think they have forgiven, but they haven't forgotten. So I'm rambling. So let me see what the next question.
Oh, I love it. And there's a question that seems to be coming up in the chat as well as in the Q&A that's really about these personality types, right? And what kind of person are there flags on the type of person that gets taken down this road? And are there ways that we can protect ourselves? And how often do they feel remorse and things like that?
So I'm gonna come back to this picture, because I will tell you that part of the reason that all of these faces have shaped me so much is they're the nicest people. They're as nice as my girlfriends. They're as nice as my cousins. I mean, they present like any one of us. And so I'm not one of those researchers that believes that there is a profile, because when you talk to any of these guys and girls, you will feel like you know them, like you know someone like them. So what makes fraud, I think, so dangerous and so scary is there's not a profile. These people on this screen are not sociopaths. They are not. They are your colleagues, your employees that you work alongside. They are just like you or me. And so that's what I think makes fraud so hard to identify, because we don't necessarily know what it looks like. Just think what we said. Helen Sharkey has an honest face. Helen Sharkey is dressed like Star Trek. She looks like a regular person. Like she would never be involved in something like that, right? So I don't believe that there's a profile.
Thank you. I'm enjoying this so much. I'm having a hard time choosing to pick and choose out of these questions and make sure that we get done on time. One of the ones that comes up, here's a great one. Any thought on the Boeing 737 MAX situation or another engineering or product oriented scenario that you've been thinking about?
I've looked at the Boeing case. I've also looked at, I've thought about teaching the Takeda Airbag case. Those are, to me, really good classic ethical dilemmas when there is the potential of death that could be involved. So when you're talking about safety. And what I've noticed, at least in my classes, and Brad, you might have noticed the same with your students, is when it's health and safety involved, people's rationale and reasoning is very different than when it's money. When it's just money, people, I think, are far more cavalier about their decision making. But when it becomes health and safety, people are much more ready to throw the book at someone. I don't know if you found the same, Brad, with your classes, but with my students, that's what I've noticed, at least with accounting students.
It definitely makes a difference. When we're talking money, it's sort of, whatever. But it definitely changes when we start talking about human life. I do the Challenger Shuttle disaster, and people definitely get emotionally invested in those types of situations.
The case that I built a game off of is a case involving a former pharmacist by the name of Robert Courtney. And Brad, you may know this case, but Robert Courtney was a pharmacist that diluted chemotherapy drugs and killed people. And what he was doing was, there were people that were stage 3, stage 4 ovarian or breast cancer, thinking they were getting their chemotherapy and there was no medicine in the treatment. He was diluting it to expand his profit margin. And he ended up being caught because the nurse started noticing that the patients weren't experiencing the traditional side effects, like nausea, loss of hair, when they would, when they would take treatment. And so she ended up taking a bag of chemo and had it tested and realized that some of the samples that she took only had 0.1 or 0% of the medication that was supposed to be in the bag. And so he's another person who was almost released from prison under compassionate release because he had met all the qualifications, but the public was in an uproar, and so they revoked it.
Awesome. I could honestly talk to you about this like for the next 3 hours, but we are at 1 o'clock and I want to make sure that we honor your other commitments and so forth. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this with us. There's so much in the chat. Like I think that we could keep these discussions going, and I feel like it's prompted a lot of really good conversations in my mind and things that I want to have with staff and with my children and all of those things. And so thank you very much, Dr. Pope. And if I understand correctly, we'll have the link available so that people who missed bits and pieces of it or who had to jump off could come back and watch this again. And I know what I'm doing tonight, Friday night. I'm going to be checking out some of these videos. I think in my next life, I would love to come back as a forensic accountant. But anyway.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and all of the conversation in the chat. I wish I could get to everybody, but one thing I've learned in these is I can't talk, look at the chat, and look at Q&A all at the same time. So I just stop. So thanks for facilitating it all, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Definitely. Thank you. You also. And we have our next webinar coming up in April, and that'll be Bonnie Oscarson, and there'll be more information coming out via your email announcements as well. Thank you to everybody who's joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Talk with you soon.